So in today's web dev tip, we're going to take a look at a really simple JavaScript array method, and it's the isArray method, which will check if an actual value that you pass into it is an array or not. So let's say, for example, we've got this array here stored in the variable called myData, and maybe we don't know what data this variable holds. Maybe it's come from an API or from some user input, and we want to check if the values inside there are contained within an array. So what we can do is call the array.isArray method in JavaScript, and then just pass it in any value. So if we pass it in that variable name, for example, it should return true because obviously the data inside there is stored in an array. But of course, if we put any other type of data inside there, like an empty string or an object or pretty much anything that's not an array, then obviously the result that we get back is false. So we can use this method to check the values that are stored inside a variable and put some safeguards in there in case the data inside the variable is not an array. So I'm going to show you a quick example of what I mean by that. So we've got this function up here called multiply by 2, which obviously loops through an array and just multiplies all of the values inside there by 2. So that should work fine for our myData variable as it has an array inside there. So if we just call it with that value inside there, and you can see the output on the right hand side is 246. But what if the value that's stored inside myData isn't an array, it's just a singular number, not inside an array, for example? Then we get a problem because we're assuming that the argument that's passed into the multiply by 2 function is actually an array. So we could do something like this. We could put an if statement inside our function and say if the array.isArray for the variable or the argument array that's passed in is true, is if that's actually an array, then we can do our map function and return the values. And at the moment, because the value that's stored inside of myData is not an array, then we get no output on the right hand side. But if we just convert that back to an array here, you should see that we get to the output from the right hand side because that if statement is now true. So that's one approach to using the isArray function, but what's more common is to do something a bit like this to check whether the variable inside of our function is actually not an array. And if it's not an array, what we're going to do is just do a bit of a conversion. We're going to say the array argument is now equal to an array itself. So we're going to create a new array and just pass that singular value inside of the function argument into that new array. So now if we just move that return statement just outside of the if statement, so that still returns the same value as before, but now if we actually remove the array from myData, and let's just change it to another number, let's change it to a 6, you can see what happens is this if statement is true because the value that's passed in is not an array, but we create a new array in a kind of a default way, and then the map statement runs before we return the values. So even though there's one value inside there, the function will still work okay. So the code inside here is a little bit messy, but just to give you an idea of how you can use the isArray method to make some checks on some arguments that are passed into a function and provide some default values if you need to. So that's pretty much it for the isArray method. Stay tuned for more web dev tips.